So if you take nothing away from this, I want this to be the takeaway. Right now is not the time for lazy science. And I feel like the research done was communicating the science in this video in a very lazy way.
Oh, that's gonna make people mad. A force field? Why are we talking about magnets? This is nothing like, no, they're using the thin shelf. That doesn't even make sense. Yarn lies side by side just fine. The science is wrong. We're getting the science wrong. Obviously misogyny. I'm not surprised at this point. We got the science wrong. How can SciShow get the science wrong? I don't like this. I don't like this at all. More of an art than a science. Like, knitting isn't incredibly mathematical. Then the physicists showed up. Oh no, this is not good. This is not, we can all do better. Who's gonna make the video to fix it?
Fine. I'll do it myself.
Some of the oldest surviving examples of two-needle knitting are fragments of socks that were found in North Africa. They are made from indigo-dyed blue and naturally white cotton and date back to around the 11th century CE. The highly complex colorwork design echoes the colors and patterning found in Islamic ceramics, with Kufic blessings knit into the socks. Because the sock uses heel shaping and complex colorwork, we know that knitting was likely invented much earlier than the age of these extant examples. And that's because knitting wasn't sitting around waiting to be discovered. Knitting was invented and developed and adapted over time. Knitting is a technology born from the human ability to solve problems with tools. Using 2 sticks and some yarn, a knitter is able to create fabric. The fabric can be shaped into useful items like socks, sweaters, Mobius bands, Klein bottles, and hyperbolic planes. Foreshadowing is a literary device that, now perhaps, knitting doesn't fill you to the brim with excitement yet. But by the end of this video, we are all going to be excited about knitting, because by translating stitch patterns into the language of math, knitting scientists are laying the groundwork for complex computer modeling that could transform the way innovators think about and design high-tech knitted fabrics. In the 800 years since those socks were made, knitting has spread everywhere through cultural exchange and colonization. It was only made more ubiquitous when knitting was industrialized and cheap machine-made goods replaced highly skilled artisan handcrafts. Swimsuits, leggings, t-shirts, hoodies, and of course, socks. You're probably wearing some knitted fabric right now. Many items we wear and use on a daily basis are made from knit fabrics. Today, industrialized knitting has evolved into a high-tech field utilizing proprietary computer-controlled machines that can produce complex fabrics at incredible speeds. Knitwear is at the cutting edge of textile manufacturing, where designs can be digitally prototyped and produced with precision far beyond what was possible even a few decades ago. And yet, people still knit by hand. Let's take a look at how knitting works. The structure of knitting in its simplest form is a series of interconnected loops. The knitter pulls yarn through the loop of a neighboring stitch, usually one row below. We call that the loop or the purl bump, and where the yarn enters and then exits the stitch, we call that the legs of the stitch. After working across the width of the fabric, one stitch at a time, a new row of stitches has been created. Work back and forth enough times and you'll have knit yourself a scarf. Not socks though. Heel shaping is way more complicated than knitting a scarf and takes a lot longer. There are hundreds of knitting stitch patterns, but the basic foundational stitch is the knit stitch. To create a knit stitch that is facing the front or right side of the fabric, the working strand of yarn is pulled up from the back through the loop of the stitch in the row below. It is drawn up so that the legs of the stitch are oriented to the front side of the fabric. This pushes the loop or the arc of the stitch we just pulled through to the back side of the fabric. We can also pull the working strand of yarn from the front of the fabric to the back or to the wrong side, which causes the legs of the stitch to sit on the back or wrong side of the fabric. This will push the bump of the stitch below that we just pulled our yarn through to the front of the fabric. We call this a reversed knit stitch or purl stitch. You can mix and match knits and purls just like programming with binary code. In fact, knitting patterns are one of the oldest forms of algorithmic design. What is exciting for scientists is that knitting is far more intricate than binary logic. Because stitches interact in three-dimensional space, knit fabric can move in ways that can't be reduced to simple ones and zeros. Anyone who is a knitter can tell you how certain stitch patterns will affect the knitted fabric. And that's because those stitch patterns have predictable effects on the fabric. And knitters learn that through experience. Let's have a pop quiz for the knitters just to prove this point. Knitters, let me know in the comments how you do. This is an example of stockinette stitch. Here's the question. Which way will the fabric curl when I let it go? Did you get it? And here is an example of garter stitch. It is created by alternating rows of knit stitches with purl stitches. So, which way will this fabric curl? Did you get that one? I'm going to go a little deeper and explain why this happens in just a moment. Here's two more examples of knitting with knit and purl stitches in specific configurations. This is called ribbing, and this is called moss stitch. Here's the question. Which of these fabrics has more stretch? How did you do, knitters? You may have known the answer, but there's also an explanation in physics. Knitted fabric is a complex matrix of interlocking loops where there are a lot of forces at work. We call these loops stitches, and this is what an individual stitch looks like. It's kind of like wrangling a snake. That's because when we bend this yarn into a loop, we are putting the yarn under tension because we are compressing the fibers at the underside of the loop and we are stretching the fibers on the top side of the loop. When we create a knit stitch with its legs in front, it is pushing on the stitch below it, forcing that loop to the back of the fabric. When we create a purl stitch with its legs in the back, it is pushing on the stitch below it from the other direction, forcing the loop of that stitch to the front of the fabric. But those loops that are being pushed to the front or to the back, they're pushing back. That's because every stitch is trying to settle into its neutral position of least resistance, but it can't get there. Remember when I was wrangling that bit of yarn and it didn't want to stay bent into a loop? Because the next stitch is going to push against it, and the next stitch will push on that stitch, and on and on. We are creating a fabric that is made up of interlocking loops that are holding and being held under tension by the stitches that surround it. Let's take a look at our knitted fabric examples one more time. In this example of stockinette, knitters know that the fabric at the top and bottom will curl towards the front of the fabric. Why? Because we've pushed all those loops to the back of the fabric, and they are pushing back. At the edges of the fabric, there's less resistance, and so the fabric is curling towards the front. In this example of garter stitch, we have alternated rows. Every other row is pushing the loops to the front, purl stitches, and every alternating row is pushing the loops to the back, knit stitches. These forces balance each other out, and so the fabric lays flat. This is an example of ribbing. It alternates one knit and one purl across each row. The stitches are aligned vertically on top of each other from the bottom of the fabric to the top, and that's why we get this sort of column effect on the fabric surface. This causes the stitches to alternate forces vertically. One column of stitches is pushing to the front and the next column is pushing to the back, essentially causing the fabric to fold up on itself. And that's why ribbing is so very stretchy. Would you believe I started this sample with the same number of stitches that I started this sample with? So what happens if I offset those columns of knits and purls by one on each row? Now we're interrupting our accordion structure, and we have drastically affected the stretchability of this fabric. Isn't knitting amazing? We can take a piece of yarn, which only stretches this much, and by reconfiguring it into a series of loops, it can now stretch this much. But wait, there's more. Knitting is more than a simple grid of horizontal and vertical stitches. Knitting is a complex matrix. That means you can't just sum up the force of each of the stitches and then spit out the result. Knitted fabric is nonlinear. Its behavior will change depending on how it's being manipulated, depending on how it is experiencing external force. If I take this piece of fabric that wants to curl to the front and I stretch it, it might elongate. But if I stretch it in a different direction, it might curl differently. But with each of those loops of yarn under tension against its neighboring loops, the fabric will have a resting form that will return to its original shape when I stop applying force to it. And that's because knitting has memory. All of these forces that are pushing or pulling on each individual stitch create an incredibly complex mechanical system. And although experienced knitters can tell you exactly what the fabric will do, that movement is very difficult to express with math. Now, for centuries, our knitting ancestors have been engaged in material science because while they were knitting, they were observing how different stitch configurations created fabrics with different properties. Then, their knitted garments were rigorously field tested in daily life. Which designs provide desired properties like warmth in cold climates, durability for hard-wearing items, water resistance in wet climates, and flexibility for fitted items? The stitches and techniques that worked were passed along to younger generations to then develop, adapt, and expand on, and on and on and on, for millennia. The sophistication of traditional knitting techniques demonstrates how deeply those knitters understood concepts like tension, elasticity, insulation, and structural integrity. They were able to engineer fabric without calculus, computer modeling, or even paper. They created complex three-dimensional forms using 2 sticks and some yarn. They were able to do this in a functional and artistic way because knitting is a technology that has been adapted and refined through generations of highly skilled craftspeople. But then the physicists showed up. The first meeting of the American Physical Society was held in Boston in 1909, and they weren't talking about the physics of knitting, because in 1909, knitting was women's work, or worse, for the poor. Even though knitting has been done by every gender throughout history, during the time that we have had academic science as an institution, we have also had a systemic devaluing of women and their contributions. Throughout the 20th century, knitting became a symbol of domesticity, and just like the women it was associated with, it was brushed off and seen as something frivolous by the men in charge. And that's why the brilliance of knitting, the engineering, the innovation, the very math of it was systemically ignored by academic science because the people doing it weren't allowed into the institutions where real science was happening. And don't worry, I brought receipts. Let's go on a little side quest together. This graph is from the American Physical Society. It shows the number of women who have earned degrees in physics out of all the degrees awarded to women in each year between 1966 and 2021. But keep in mind that what we're looking at here is a slice of a slice. Let's focus on the doctorates because those with PhDs are likely to have the positions that would be decision-making in regards to research and topics like knitting. In 1966, out of 20,617 total doctorate degrees awarded across the United States, only 2,454 went to women. And just a quick footnote, when I say women, this is including all women, all ethnicities, United States citizens, United States residents, and those who are here on education visas. If you'd like to see the numbers yourself, you can find them at the National Center for Education Statistics, and I have all the links for everything in the description down below. But I do have some good news though. There is hard-won progress being made for women in STEM. In 2021, out of 193,000 doctorate degrees awarded, 107,000 went to women. From the bottom of my heart, congratulations, doctors. And that's why now I can say, but then the women showed up. Now that more women are in STEM, we're finally seeing technologies like knitting getting the attention they deserve. And not because men suddenly figured it out. There might be something useful here. But because women who are both scientists and knitters are bringing their full expertise into academic research and they're being taken seriously. Dr. Elisabetta Matsumoto, right there in the center, is a physicist at Georgia Tech. She knits. She studies the physics of knitting. And she's leading a whole team of scientists and researchers who are studying the physics of knitting. In 2017, Dr. Matsumoto opened a 3-hour session called Fabric, Knits, and Knots at the American Physical Society's annual meeting. That was the first time the technology of knitting had ever been formally addressed at that conference. Ever. In over a century. We will discuss the science they are working on in just a moment, but I had to take this side quest to point out that when you combine knitting and science, the knitting community is so excited. And that's because we already know that this incredible human technology is amazing and it should be studied. But it has been so intertwined with the propaganda of femininity and misogyny throughout the 20th century, if not longer, that to some of us, it becomes difficult to separate the trivialization of knitting and the systemic devaluation of women. All right, friends, how are we doing? That was a lot. We need to talk about the science because I'm so excited about it. Let's take a deep breath, maybe stretch, maybe hydrate. All right, everybody with me? Side quest complete. In Nature Communications in 2024, Dr. Elisabetta Matsumoto and her team published a paper titled Programming Mechanics in Knitted Materials, Stitch by Stitch. Dr. Matsumoto's team is exploring how knitted fabrics behave as a mechanical metamaterial, meaning the properties of knitted fabric are not solely determined by the characteristic of the yarn it's made from. The structure of the stitches themselves can change the properties of the yarn and how the fabric behaves. The researchers argue that knitting is a form of additive manufacturing where each individual stitch is a programmable unit that contributes to the fabric's overall mechanical behavior. We're talking about programmable fabric. Remember how the knitters in the chat could predict the behavior of the knitted fabric samples? Those were the same 4 types of fabric samples used by the team to develop a mathematical model that predicts how knitted fabrics will behave under stress. And the math is based on the stitch architecture. This computer model can help design textiles with customized mechanical properties. And remember all of that industrialized high-tech knitting producing machinery I mentioned earlier? We have the manufacturing technology to produce the fabric. So what exactly do we mean when we say programmable fabric? Let's look at a hypothetical kind of example. Imagine opening your IKEA box and it pops itself together. Now imagine, this is what we're talking about, deployable structures that could unfold into a specific shape once they're in orbit, but they can pack down small. Or imagine athletic gear that's knit with conductive yarns and sensors to monitor athletic performance. Imagine that instead of having robots made of rigid plastic and metal, mechanical behavior could be programmed into structural fabric, allowing soft robots to move, grip, and adapt without requiring complex motors or sensors. I just imagine being in an unfortunate circumstance and I get rescued by a sweater. That would be cozy and very comforting. Don't think of the scary robots. But imagine the potential applications for prosthetics and other assistive devices. Research is also being done by Dr. Lauren New and her team. They published knitted geometry and programmable curvature in Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences in 2025. Their research uses mathematical modeling to predict how different stitch patterns will deform under pressure, creating a framework for designing self-folding adaptive textiles. In an interview for Tech and Science Post, Dr. New said, "Right now, we're focused on fundamental stitches, knits and purls, but the real world of knitting is much richer." New says the goal is to take the mathematical approach and expand it to include cables, lace, and other advanced techniques that knitters have developed over centuries. Dr. New said in that same interview that the physicists rely on intuition and trial and error, but translating that into precise predictive science is a challenge. The technology of knitting has developed over centuries, and science is finally catching up. All right, friends, how are we all doing? I have a few thoughts that didn't really fit inside the video somewhere that made sense. So I'm going to do just a quick little post side quest, I guess. And I don't know if the SciShow team or Hank Green is going to watch this video. If you do, then I just want to be very clear that none of this is personal. I feel like when you publish something online, there is sort of a unwritten, unspoken, I guess, contract between your content and the viewer. And when it is published, it means that it is open to fair critique. And I hope that you understand that my intention here was fair critique and nothing personal. But I do think that there are a few other things that we really need to address. Also, if you're just watching this video for the funsies, thank you. And if you made it this far, I'm going to bless you. May your yarn never barf and may your stitches never drop. All right, so here's how science works, right? Something is published and then it is peer reviewed. And then maybe people get ideas and they further the research and then they publish something and that's peer reviewed. And sometimes something is reviewed and that review doesn't go over well. And I think that's what's happened here. But in the spirit of science, I really hope that this can be a learning opportunity and we can all do better. So there are a few things that I wanted to address. First of all, I'm not going to rehash the misogyny of it all. I hope my video was clear in drawing that parallel between knitting being wielded as a tool of misogyny and women being kept out of STEM, and all of that sort of coalescing in this video with some really big issues that are certainly beyond the scope of a SciShow video. But the misogyny hasn't been addressed. There's been some responses on TikTok and in a pinned comment, and quite a few people have been calling it out and it hasn't been addressed. And I really think it needs to be addressed because there is a larger issue at play here, and it's a big part of why I wanted to make this video. So if you take nothing away from this, I want this to be the takeaway. Right now is not the time for lazy science. And I feel like the research done was communicating the science in this video in a very lazy way. To not understand the connection between knitting and misogyny and to poo-poo the knitting traditions within a science video, that is exactly the kind of attitude that we potentially could see from a certain administration looking through where federal money is being spent. Because let me be clear, the funding for much of this knitting research that's going on is coming from federal grants. And I can absolutely see someone in our administration looking at that and saying, why are we researching knitting? That's for the females. Defunded. And that pervasiveness is so baked into culture that it can't not be called out. I'm sorry if there's a double negative. It has to be called out. And so I hope at the very least the misogyny gets addressed somewhere, because women are losing our bodily autonomy. Now is not the time. Now is not the time. And so there was a pinned comment in the response from the SciShow team, which I read, and I feel like it was very insufficient. There's a couple things I wanted to address there. First of all, the mislabeled picture of, it was the reverse side of stockinette, and it was labeled as stockinette. Why does that matter? Well, in the response, we were told that, oops, a mislabeled picture doesn't negate the trust in SciShow for bringing good science and lessons and stuff. And so I need to explain something here. That's not how errata works. Errata is where you identify the mistake and correct the mistake, and we all move on. I've never been told in an errata how to feel about the errata. Like, if you are publishing science information, you need to have some kind of a system for an actual errata, because mistakes happen, even with the best editorial team. Mistakes can happen. That's fine. However, don't tell me that I should still have trust in the work that SciShow is doing. I get to decide that. That's up to me. And frankly, you did break some of my trust. And so, Hank Green, if you are watching this, I understand you have a team. I understand you show up and read the script. However, sir, you are the face of SciShow, and many of us appreciate your work. Many of us love your app with that stinking cute little bean. Why does he have a butt? I don't know. It's cute. Anywho, sir, you're dabbling in the knitting community. And you're not addressing the issues that the knitting community is bringing to you. It's not just about knitting being cool stuff. We also have a huge problem with this video being the way it was because it was bad science. And in an environment of anti-intellectualism, that doesn't fly. And when you make a video about knitting and then you get the knitting wrong, yes, I do lose trust. I do lose trust, and you can't tell me not to. You get to rebuild the trust. That's how that works. So I read every single paper, every single citation that was in the cited sources from the SciShow video. I read every single one through the whole thing, start to finish. And it was clear to me that some of it had been read and put into the video without an understanding of what was being read. So another issue that a lot of people had was with the toe socks. And then we got this thing in the pinned comment that this was actually the thing we were referring to. And I am going to call BS on that, because what you did in that pinned comment was linked directly to the, the virtual place that holds just that specific item, and I don't think that's where that came from. Also, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, they have a blog post about the history of knitting, and I would bet dollars to donuts that that is where the team went to get their information. And on that page, it does show that Egyptian toe sock, and it shows the piece that you said you were referencing right next to each other. And I really think that the reason we were all confused as viewers who understand that history is because you conflated the two, because you didn't read that article well. So also, I have to say that there were some things that were taken out of context and some things that were misquoted. I will not do that work for you. I will let you vet your editorial process, but I really think that you need to have a conversation with your technical editors. I understand that SciShow's goal is to communicate science and that sometimes you're going to simplify terms. I did that myself with this very video here. However, saying things like, oh, we called them knots because we are simplifying terms. I didn't call them knots. You know why? Because knot theory is a field of mathematics that is part of topology, which is part of studying the surface of knitting fabrics. You were literally using a scientific mathematical term wrong. You were using it wrong. And when you were called out on that, you were like, oh, but we make it simple for people. No, you made it wrong for people. And again, we are in a place, an atmosphere, a milieu, if you will, of anti-intellectualism. And I don't think it's okay right now to have sloppy education and sloppy science. And I think that part of the big reason why so many people were upset is because, Hank Green, you are the face of SciShow, and so many of us have appreciated your work. And for something like this to come at us that was just egregiously wrong, it felt a little more like a betrayal than a disappointment. At least that's what I've seen within the community. So I am not saying that this script was generated. However, I would check with that team because it was a little more than a missed yarn over. I really feel like this was a dropped stitch. And if you read the pinned comment, you know what I mean. All right, friends, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to say all this stuff because I think that the conversation about misogyny has been needed and important, and it's been said. And I think that there's a bigger picture here that needed to be addressed. And that's what long form is here for. So here we are with long form. All right, if you're a knitter, tell me what you're knitting down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video when I decide to talk about some other big issues, I guess. Happy knitting!